Welcome everyone to this lecture on files. And before we finish off this section of the course, we already learned about all the basic data types. I now want to quickly go over how to perform simple input and output with a basic text file. And the methods we show here will also expand further to working with other file types, whether it be an audio file, text file, emails, Excel documents. A lot of what we cover here is going to be really relatable to those more advanced functionalities. Now keep in mind, for some of those other topics, you may need to install certain libraries, which we're going to discuss later on in this course. For right now, we're going to deal with just basic.txt files. So we're going to create one using the Jupyter Notebook, and we'll also discuss file paths on your computer. Let's get started. To begin, what we need to do is create a text file to work with. Now, if you downloaded those notes, there's actually already a test.txt file. So in your folder somewhere, there should be a test.txt file in the same folder as these notes are in. So keep that in mind, but I'm going to show you how you can use Jupyter's magic functionality, or so it's called, in order to quickly write a text file. So this only works in Jupyter Notebook. So write %, write file, space, my file.txt, or whatever you want to call it. So this has to be on the first line of the cell. And then here you can just write plain text of whatever you want is in the cell. So I can say, hello, this is a text file. This is the second line. This is the third line. Let me make sure I spell that right. So again, this only works in a Jupyter Notebook. If you don't have Jupyter Notebooks, maybe you're working in Sublime Text Editor, go ahead and just write this into a file and save it as a .txt file in the same location as wherever your scripts are running. So we're going to run that, and you should see successfully wrote my file.txt file. And now what we can do is actually open up and play around with these files. Now it's a very common mistake to accidentally either write the wrong name of the file or save the file in the wrong directory. So let me show you what that typically looks like. We'll say my file is equal to, and we use the open function. And in this case, I know my file.txt is there because I can just write my file.txt, and we need to write this as a string. So write that, and then we'll get no error because it happens to be there. If I ask for a file that is not there, we'll say my file is equal to open, and we'll say, whoops, wrong txt. So I definitely know there's no file there. If I run this, we'll get a file not found error. So this is a really common error. It's called error number 2. No such file or directory. Whoops, wrong.txt. So there's really only two possible ways to get this error. One way is that we accidentally passed in the wrong file name. So in this case, I wrote whoops, wrong txt file. So that's the wrong file name. The file name should have been myfile.txt. Now, the other possibility is that I actually didn't provide the correct file path. And we'll discuss that more later on in this same lecture. But maybe you have whoops wrong.txt on your computer, but it just doesn't happen to be saved in the same location as your Jupyter Notebook. To know where your Jupyter Notebook currently is, you can type pwd into a cell, run that, and that will print your working directory. So this directory is where this notebook is currently located, and that's the same location that any .txt files you want to work with should be saved. Later on, we'll show you how to call a text file from any location on your computer, but for right now, make sure that the text file you're working with is saved to the same location that is output when you type pwd. All right, continuing on, we know that myfile.txt is in the same location because we use this special command to write it there. And if you don't want to use a special command, you have the test.txt file from the zip file of notes. So let's continue on here. We'll say my file is equal to open, and we're going to open that text file we just made, which was called myfile.txt. Myfile.txt, run that. And now there's several methods I can call off of this. One method I can call is the read method. And what this does is it returns just a giant string of everything that's in this text file. Sometimes that's good, sometimes you don't want that, but it is a method that's available to you. You'll notice here that we have this \n, and what this does is it indicates a new line. Because you asked for everything as a single string, the string somehow needs to represent where the new lines were in your text file. Because remember, we wrote, hello, this is a text file, Here on a second line, we wrote second line, and on a third line, we wrote third line. So in order to represent that, we have these escape sequences that we discussed earlier in the string lectures, and \n represents new line. Now, if I try to read this file again, you'll notice something funny happens. You get back an empty string. So a lot of times beginners are scratching their head thinking, well, what the heck happened? I just read it, and now when I try to read it again, it's no longer there. The reason this is happening is because you can imagine that there's a cursor at the beginning of the file, and when you read it, the cursor goes all the way to the end of the file. And you need to reset the cursor or seek it back to 0 in order to read it again. So to do that, you can say my file seek 0. That resets the cursor. You should see some 0 output there. And now if you call read again, you'll be able to see this. Keep in mind, if you ever want to read again more times, you'll have to reset that. You'll have to say my file seek 0. And then you say my file read, and let's save this as contents. And now if I check my contents, that's just one giant string. So that's the read method, and it allows you to grab everything as one giant string. Sometimes that's not really useful because you'd actually want to have a list where each single element in the list is one line in a string form of the actual text file. And to do that, it's actually quite simple. You can use the read lines method. So we're going to seek back to 0 and then say my file read lines, and note what we get back here. Now we have each line as a separate object or element in this list. And a lot of times this is more convenient to work with because now I can loop through this list, which we'll learn about later on, or I can index off of this list for the lines themselves. All right, so those are the basic methods of reading a basic text file, which is .read to grab everything as a string, or read lines to grab a list where each element represents a line. Keep in mind, you still have that \n there at the end of that. Let's move on to discussing file locations. Now previously, we just showed you how to open a text file that happens to be in the same location as your Python script or Python notebook. But what if you want to open a text file that's saved in another location on your computer? It'd be really annoying to have to constantly be moving around your Python scripts or your notebook location to be at the same location as that text file. So to open a text file that's at any location on your computer, all you need to do is provide the full file path. Keep in mind, however, the syntax for a file path is slightly different depending if you're on Windows or if you're on macOS or Linux. So for Windows, the typical file path is going to look something like this. You'll say C:, and then note that we have the double backslash, and this basically is an escape character so that Python doesn't confuse this first backslash as an escape character. Because imagine if your username had a lowercase n, you don't want Python suddenly thinking you mean new line. So that's why we have double backslashes here. So this is for Windows, and it looks something like this. And you just pass in the whole file path as a string to your text file. If you're on macOS or Linux, it looks a little different. You have forward slashes here, and it goes users, your username, whatever folder, and then to the text file. If you ever want to check what this actually looks like, all you need to do is use that handy pwd into a cell again, and you'll notice that I already have kind of the format of what it should look like. I'm running this on a Windows computer right now, so it shows me what the format is, and then from there I can copy paste and then play around with this, add folder paths, etc. in order to grab the right text file. To finish off this discussion of files, I want to mention best practices for opening files. Right now, we open this file and we called it my file, but technically because it's open, we actually have to close it. We have to say myfile.close in order to not get any errors, because let's say you opened this file somewhere else on your computer and you were trying to delete it, you'd get an error saying, hey, Python is still using this file, and you'd have to actually manually close it once you were done working with it. To avoid any such errors, what you can do is use the special with statement. And it looks like this. You'll say, instead of saying something like this, let's first see the old way, which was my file open test.txt. So that was the old way of doing things. And I believe it was called myfile.txt. What we can do is say with open, and then we'll say as, and then whatever you want to call this. You can say my new file. So this is the variable name you choose. And then you have a colon there. And then notice what happens here. When I hit enter, I have an indentation. And basically what this means is that any code here that's within this block, this indented block of code, is going to use my new file as the variable of this text file. So then I can say contents is equal to my new file read. And when I run this, I no longer need to worry about closing the file. Let me quickly check that that was the right text file name. We'll come up here and confirm that, and we were right. Okay, so let's run this and see what happens. So I run that, and now I no longer worry about closing the file, and I can still grab the contents that were in this block of code. And we're going to get used to this idea of these indented block of codes a lot more in the next section of the course. Okay, let's finish off this discussion by talking about reading and writing to a file. Right now, you may have noticed that we've basically just been reading files, but we can also write to files and overwrite files. And that's a key difference that we need to appreciate. So we're going to say with open, and I'm going to say with open my file.txt, comma, and what I'm going to do here is right with my cursor right next to open, I'm going to do shift tab. And what this does is it opens up information for functions that have already been defined. So later on we're going to define our own functions, but you'll notice open is a built-in function. So you can see here some documentation, and this is why I love using the Jupyter Notebook for teaching Python, because just with the term shift tab right next to the function, you get all this really useful information. You can have plus here to see even more stuff. So you basically have the documentation right here in your notebook without needing to go online. All right, so notice here there's a mode, and it's set by default equal to R. So we're going to copy this and paste it right here. Say mode is equal to R, and then say as my file content is equal to my file read. So when I run this, there's no problem. I see the contents, and there it is. Now let's switch this to W, which stands for write. If I try running this cell again, it will say, hey, unsupported operation, not readable. And that's because depending on what mode you choose for opening your files, you may only choose to write to a file instead of being able to read to a file. And this is basically known as permissions. Sometimes you're going to want certain scripts to only have permissions to write to a file or only have permissions to read to a file. And sometimes you want them to have both. So what we can do here is the following options. We can use R for read or W for write, and this will overwrite files. Or we can use A to append to files, and append is basically just adding more lines to the end of a text file. Okay, so let's take a little bit of time to discuss the reading, writing, and appending modes. So we just showed you that you can edit that mode. Let's discuss all of them very quickly one more time. If you set mode is equal to R, that's read only. If you set mode equal to W, that's write only. So this will overwrite files that already exist. Or if you try to open a file that doesn't exist already and you open it with mode W, it'll actually create a new file, and we'll see that in just a second. And then mode A is to append only, and this adds on to files. R plus is for reading and writing, and then W plus is opening a file for both writing and reading, and that again will overwrite the existing file if the file exists. If the file does not exist, it creates a new file for reading and writing. So to play around with these, let's create a new file, and I'll do this from the Jupyter Notebook. You can do this from any text editor as well, but I'm going to write my new file.txt, 1 on first, 2 on second, 3 on third. I'm going to run that to confirm that I've just created my new file.txt. In this case, I overwrote it because I'd run this more than once. But let's do the following. We'll say with open, and we'll say my new file. And you should be able to actually tab autocomplete this. So my new file.txt, mode, we'll say read only, as f, and then I'm going to print f.read. And there I can see 1 on first, 2 on second, 3 on third. So that's the read mode, which is quite useful for reading. Let's say I wanted to add a new line to this. I could say with open, my new file.txt, I will say mode is equal to, and in this case I'm going to say A because I want to append a new line to this. We'll say as f. And if I want to write to a file, all I have to do is say f dot, and as you may have expected, instead of read, you say write. And let's write a new line to this. We'll say 4 on 4th. So notice what I'm doing here. Because I'm using append, that means the cursor is all the way at the end of this text file, and then it's going to append or add on a 4th line to it. So I'm going to run that, and then let's rerun the code up here. I'm going to copy and paste this to a new cell. And if I run this again, now I see 1 on 1st, 2 on 2nd, 3 on 3rd, 4 on 4th. Something I didn't actually take into account here is that I forgot to add in a new line. So what I could have done is say \n here to actually insert a new line. So if we run these two cells again, now we see 4 on 4th. Now, unfortunately, I still have this 4 on 4th here, so I'm going to reset everything by coming back up here and overwriting that file one more time. So let's run these again, run this cell again, and then run this cell again. And now I can see 1 on 1st, 2 on 2nd, 3 on 3rd, 4 on 4th. So that's the difference between reading and appending. Now let's explore W for writing. I can say with open, and here I'm just going to make up a bunch of letters, .txt, and I'll say mode is equal to W. And remember, with this W mode, it's going to overwrite an existing file, or if the file doesn't exist, it will actually create it. So we can make up a name there, say as f, and then say f write. I created this file. Run that, and there's no error. It's because even though this text file doesn't exist, since we opened it with mode W, Python went ahead and created that text file for us. If we had tried to do the same thing with a different mode, such as just R or just A, we would have gotten an error there. So then we'll go ahead and read this file. We'll say with open dhf, and I really encourage you now just to do tab autocomplete, so you don't have to memorize all that. We'll say mode is equal to read as f, and let's print out f.read. And there we can see I created this file. So those are the basic ideas of opening files in either append mode, write mode, or read mode. And you can see a lot more examples of this in your notebook that goes along with this lecture. Okay, thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture where we actually begin testing you on a lot of the topics that we discussed here.